What's going on, guys? I'm Tyler, and to continue my brand new series of classical movie reviews, I'm here to let you know that Anatomy of a Murder is no perfect movie. And it centers on former district attorney Paul Beagler, played by Jimmy Stewart, who reluctantly decides to defend a soldier accused of murder. But the problem is, the soldier has openly confessed to the killing to just about everyone he's met. So Beagler decides he has to get a little creative in regards to coming up with the defense. The main defense that he's trying to push is that his client is not guilty by reason of insanity. And when you think of Jimmy Stewart in a legal movie, you probably already expect him to be the one lawyer who knows his client is innocent, but the evidence is stacked up against him, so he has to use his wits and his perseverance in order to obtain the law and justice. But that's Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a much better performance and much better movie, if I'm being completely honest. But the biggest surprise about this movie not only is just how morally questionable of a character Jimmy Stewart plays, which is much more of a change of pace than you're used to, but everyone's thoughts and feelings about what's right or wrong, especially with this murder case, is always constantly blurry, and that's actually what makes the second half of the movie, that's almost exclusively about the main trial, so investing and intense that you really just can't take your eyes off of it. Whenever you see a witness go up and take their testimony, they have the utmost confidence based on their facial expressions and their line delivery, and you definitely get the sense that they believe everything that they're saying to the court. Until they get cross-examined and they end up switching from looking embarrassed, shocked, or just flat out angry. And what's great about it is that there's always multiple reasons left up to imagination as to why they've suddenly changed their feelings. Is it because they were caught lying? Is it because no one has ever questioned their moral ethics before? Were they coached by the prosecution or defense? And if so, were they not trained on how to receive criticism from the other side? This movie is left so up to interpretation in regards to the moral ambiguity of the characters, and it's just a great example of how what's considered right and wrong really depends on each person. But in the eyes of the law that's enforced by the government, by the police, by judges, it really doesn't matter. It's not worth jack shit what your beliefs on right or wrong are. And Jimmy Stewart's performance was such a big surprise because, as I said before, this is a much different character for him. He's a lot more morally questionable. When he's interviewing defense witnesses, he has the utmost respect for them. When he's cross-examining the prosecution, he goes back and forth from having these very quiet wisecracks to these huge bursts of theatrics, anger, and shouting that just get everybody riled up, which is kind of part of his technique as a lawyer. But what's interesting is he's able to differentiate people in real life versus people that he meets in court, because when he does talk to average civilians in everyday life, he's actually a lot more respectful. He's a lot more calm and composed in regards to his expressions and line delivery. But he's also not afraid to politely judge people based on their actions and offer his own 2 cents. My favorite scene is actually when he interviews a potential witness and flat out says why he is the type of lawyer that he is. He's learned the hard way that no one is all good or all bad. Everyone's just all kinds of things. And he's probably that experienced of a lawyer to the point where I think he's basically accepted that, and I think he's accepted it about himself most of all. Joseph N. Welch, as the judge who's presiding over this case, doesn't really have a ton of character depth, but he doesn't really need to be because he's the most unbiased character throughout this entire court case. Whenever the prosecution and defense are going at each other, it's always fun to see him try his best to maintain the peace, to discipline other lawyers for coming so close to being in contempt of the court, especially when he has to silence Jimmy Stewart for all of the theatrics that are really just there to play things in his favor as opposed to processing the facts. He's a firm believer in the written law, and that's actually what makes him the most sympathetic character in all of these trials, because you feel just as frustrated whenever facts go into someone else's favor or the truth gets misrepresented, and he's there to constantly point things out. These cases are not based on people's emotions. They are based on facts. They are based on written law. And it's great that we have a character like that literally being the moral center, because he is the one in between the defense and the prosecution's desk. And even though he's not really in it as much as I was hoping he would be, George C. Scott was really good as this slimy prosecutor that's kind of brought into the prosecution as like extra muscle just because Jimmy Stewart was once a DA. And I was expecting George C. Scott to be a lot more gruff in his voice, kind of like what he was like in Patton or Doctor Strangelove, that would make him seem so despicable every time he discredits a witness or makes something even more credible to his point. And he definitely has those qualities, but what really surprised me was just how soft-spoken he was every time he was doing a cross-examination. I wouldn't expect that from General Patton, as I said before, but what was so interesting was his soft line delivery combined with how happy and calm he's constantly acting towards the entire prosecution just makes him seem a lot more cocky and stuck up. And no matter how often he's right, you just love to hate this bastard because he's not really even in it to provide justice. He's another prosecutor who just wants to win another case. There was one point where I actually flipped off the screen at him whenever he got proven wrong. It just felt good to me. I don't really know why. Now, the courtroom scenes are definitely worth the watch of this movie 100%, especially because this is a 100% fresh Rotten Tomatoes movie. I gotta stop picking these. But there are two things that keep this, to me personally, from being a great movie. One is the huge length of 2 hours and 40 minutes. I felt like you definitely could have trimmed some stuff down. You could have gotten rid of a couple characters so that other ones can get to shine. There's this one snarky secretary of Jimmy Stewart who's always pointing out how he needs to take cases that he doesn't even want to take just because dude's flat out broke. He's not a DA anymore. He really does have to start putting in the effort. I liked seeing her on screen and wanted more of her. But instead, we had more scenes of this, I don't know, comrade of his who's constantly drinking, and there's a central arc about him sobering up in order to assist the case, which would have been interesting, but it's not given the same level of importance as the case or as Jimmy Stewart or his defendants, which is interesting because he does provide key vital information that serve as the main twist of the movie, but it's not presented in a way that feels really cinematic or even dramatic in terms of writing. It's just like, well, we need a twist. Let's just have him abruptly enter this one scene, give the fact, and then abruptly exit out. He felt very forced and kind of rushed in terms of development, and I didn't think he was a character that felt necessary. But my biggest problem with this movie is that tonally, it really feels all over the place. This is a movie about a rape and murder, but the stakes don't really feel all that high. If anything, it feels like Otto Preminger as director was trying to have a much more upbeat atmosphere because the movie goes without an overall soundtrack, and when there are pieces of music, they sound very upbeat, even when he's trying to investigate potential witnesses and figures in this case. And I'm just sitting there going, this music does not fit what you're investigating. I don't know what you're trying to do. Are you trying to lighten the mood? I get that times were different back then and you couldn't say rape and murder as much as we do now, but it doesn't really change the fact that you chose to tackle this subject matter, so tackle it as dark as you can possibly go. And weirdly enough, the rape in this movie isn't even treated with that much seriousness. I'm not going to spoil who the victim is, but she doesn't really seem all that fazed by it. And a lot of people are going to say, well, that's part of the ambiguity of the movie, which might be the case. But if it turns out it is true that she was a victim, it's really outdated and uncomfortable to sift through if that's the case. And if it turns out she's not a victim, then it's incredibly obvious to just about everyone she meets, which doesn't really make me feel invested or intense as I'm watching her be cross-examined, because I kind of already know for a fact what kind of person she is, because she flaunts her true personality in front of anyone as if no one's gonna notice, which really didn't even make sense half the time. So, in regards to certain cultural depictions, it is pretty outdated, and I do think that 10 to 20 minutes of this movie could have been trimmed out with other side characters so that others can get their fair due, and you could focus a lot more on the investigation, on the case, on the research that Stewart has to do in order to find an insanity defense, because that was one of the interesting things. This movie is a little bit more about doing legal research so that you can actually come up with a credible defense. And I think that's the reason this movie gets shown a lot in law courses in order to provide examples, because lawyers think this is one of the most realistic courtroom dramas that have ever existed. But I'm getting sidetracked here. So, my problems with this movie are very clear. Tonally, it doesn't always make sense and feels a little culturally outdated. Lengthwise, it really didn't need to be that long. You could have trimmed out 10 to 20 minutes and you would have given more credibility to the trial scenes, which were so good. But that's the main reason to watch this movie. Whenever the characters are there during the trial, it is well acted, it is well written, well directed. It has that directing style that's more about putting actors in the frame as opposed to doing flashy things with the camera. And overall, it was just an engaging legal drama that wasn't To Kill a Mockingbird by any means, but it definitely wasn't trying to be. It was just trying to be its own thing. And for all those reasons, I am going to recommend that you seek out Anatomy of a Murder. And I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. Guys, thanks as always for watching. If you have seen Anatomy of a Murder, let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. Be sure to stay tuned for more classical movie reviews, and be sure to like and subscribe. Take care.